So some weeks you're going to come back and say, geez, I backslid completely and I played for 4 hours a day for 7 days. But it doesn't matter, because that doesn't mean you failed, it just means that you slid back. You want to calculate it over a month or something like that. And, generally speaking, a month later the person's down to something like 2 hours a day, and you've figured out ways of filling their time in with something productive otherwise, and they're on their way. And the general consequence of that is that every time they manage an accomplishment, they get a little stronger in character, they get a little bit more confident in their ability, they get a little bit less racked with self-disgust, they get a little bit more hopeful about the future, and they get more confident that they can make another change. And if you're patient, and you have to be patient with yourself that way, it's like you reward those incremental improvements and you don't get all cynical about them, and you think, okay, just imagine what would happen if you kept doing that every week for 10 years. And the answer to that is, things would be so much better for you that you can't even imagine it, with that much improvement.
So I've made multiple videos on Jordan Peterson in the past, mainly talking about cultural Marxism and how he spreads this conspiracy theory. But today I want to talk about addiction and treatment and how he is so hypocritical towards it, and if you should care or not that he's suffering with such a hard time. So I guess what we're going to do in the video is show a generic Jordan Peterson argument about how one deals with addiction. Then we're going to talk about his struggles with addiction and talk about, the traumatic time he's gone through, and then talk about how he's such a hypocrite in dealing with his personal struggles, but, contrasting that with the advice he gives. And then we're going to go into just general societal causes of, opioid addiction, of drug addiction, because it flies in the face of personal responsibility, which conservatives and libertarians like to talk so much about. But before we get any further, if you want to support my work, please check out my Patreon in the description. I'm going to revamp it next week. We're going to get a private Patreon Discord going. We're going to put other benefits on there, because I'm sorry, so far I haven't rewarded any patrons, but that's going to change when I take this YouTube thing more seriously starting next week. And if you want to follow me on any social medias, that is all in the description as well. Now, like I said at the beginning, we're going to look at generic advice Jordan Peterson gives to deal with addiction. Now, this is in regard to video games, so it might seem like it's not relevant, but when he talks about lots of different things, he doesn't relegate addiction to alcohol or opioid abuse or anything. He talks about general addiction. So let's take a look at this clip to see how he feels about this sort of thing.
For example, an individual that takes your program and authors his or her future already has taken the first steps of personal responsibility by doing something about it. So let's assume that we assume responsibility for our lives. We get our acts together and we start with our rooms, and we broaden the circle, and we want to start helping people out in the world that don't have this first seed of responsibility.
If you're a behavioral psychologist, and I am a behavioral psychologist, what you do is you find out what, essentially you help a person establish their aim, and then you break down what they're trying to do into attainable units, and you negotiate with them. You say, well, look, they say, I'm not making use of my time very well, spending 3 hours a day playing video games. And you say, well, okay, hypothetically, how much time would you like to spend playing video games? And they say, well, I could probably spend an hour a day without it interfering with the rest of my life, which is kind of the issue, right? Because if you play video games, fine, but maybe 3 hours means that you're not doing your homework or something, and that's not a good game. So you say, okay, well, I want to play for an hour a day. It's like, okay, well, can you shift to an hour a day right now? And this is supposed to be an honest conversation. And the person says, no, I've tried that lots of times. Every time I try, I just fail. And so you don't say, well, quit failing, go play 1 hour a day, and the problem will be solved. That's a stupid strategy. You say, okay, well, look, you think about this, and don't agree to do this unless you think you will do it, because otherwise it's just a waste of both of our times. It's like, do you think that you could track how much time you spend playing video games for 1 week? Don't change anything. Just track it. And they think, yeah, I could probably do that, but I might miss a couple of days. And you think, okay, fine. So here's the deal. 5 out of the next 7 days, you just track how much time you spend playing video games. And the person says, I think I can do that. Because that's what you want them to say. You want them to succeed at the improvement. It's not much of an improvement, but it's something, right? Then they come back and they say, well, yeah, I was playing about 4 hours a day. And so you say, okay, well, fine, good work, man. You got it tracked. Now we know the parameters of your problem. It's actually a little worse than you thought, but at least you had enough sense to measure it. We know where you're at. Okay. Do you think you could cut that down to 3.5 hours every day? And the person thinks, no, I'm pretty weak-willed. I don't think I could manage that. You say, well, how about this? Do you think that 2 of the next 7 days you can only play for 3 hours? You think you can manage that? And you're not cynical about this. You're not insulting the person, any of that. It's like, because you don't care. All you care is that they make some incremental movement towards their goal. And the person thinks about that, if they have any sense, and they take their weakness into account, and they think, I think I could probably do that. And then they come back the next week, and they say, I managed to spend 3 hours a day playing video games for 3 days, and the rest were 4 hours. And you say, good work, man. You've just got rid of 25%. 12.5% of your problem. You're 1/8 of the way to fixing it. No, generally speaking, a month later, the person's down to something like 2 hours a day, and you've figured out ways of filling their time in with something productive otherwise, and they're on their way. And the general consequence of that is that every time they manage an accomplishment, they get a little stronger in character, they get a little bit more confident in their ability, they get a little bit less racked with self-disgust, they get a little bit more hopeful about the future, and they get more confident that they can make another change. And if you're patient, and you have to be patient with yourself that way, it's like you reward those incremental improvements and you don't get all cynical about them, and you think, okay, just imagine what would happen if you kept doing that every week for 10 years.
So like I said, not strictly related to opioid abuse, but the argument remains sort of the same. It's that it's a personal accountability, a personal responsibility issue, right? In the case he was using, to get off being addicted to playing 3 hours of video games a day, you've got to take it, I guess, day by day and slowly cut it down and reward yourself. And if you don't do that sort of stuff, it's because you're a weak person, you're weak-willed. Now, this is pretty generic advice for people dealing with, I guess, more frivolous addictions. I wouldn't say any addiction is like that, but I guess Jordan Peterson and other people wouldn't take video game addiction seriously, although I think all addictions have some sort of equality to them, that they can ruin your life. But this is the problem I find with conservatives, with libertarians, even with atheists. They think everything exists in some theoretical world. Like, if I have an addiction issue, that's because I'm just weak and I'm given into these vices and I'm lazy and I can't break out of a habit. So I just give in and I take it to make myself feel better because I just rely on it so much. And of course we have the Jordan Peterson meme about cleaning your room and, you know, this 12 steps to improving your life. And he's actually releasing a new book about, you know, improving your life even further, despite showing that he can't actually follow his own advice, which I don't think is good advice in the first place. So let's get into what Jordan Peterson's been dealing with. I'm sure a lot of you are aware he has an opioid addiction and he's really been going through an awful time. So according to his daughter, Peterson began taking the anti-anxiety drug in the benzo class a few years ago to counter an autoimmune reaction caused by certain foods. After his wife's terminal cancer diagnosis in April 2019, his dependence on the drug grew severe. Attempts to treat the problem in North American clinics failed. The quest for expert care to wean Peterson off the drug, treat withdrawal symptoms and deal with a nasty side effect which can make a person uncontrollably restless, brought Peterson and his daughter to Russia and then Serbia. It's been a long and, by all accounts, excruciatingly hard journey right now. Peterson is reportedly on the mend and has resumed writing every day, although recent vlogs on his daughter's YouTube channel, in which he talks at length about the past year, talks about depression, and this being the hardest point in his life. Now, I feel Peterson has been a very destructive force. I think, you know, his advice has been bad, and I think the way he sort of makes it you're a weak person, you're weak-willed, it's a personal accountability issue, is really damaging for people. But let's get into the things I didn't read in the article. He got a prescription for, I think it's Xanax, and he abused that to start with, right? So that's not very good personal accountability there. And also his treatment in Russia. He went to a treatment center where they chemically try to help you overcome addiction. They put like drug blockers in your brain. And then, of course, he went through an awful time because this actually is a very risky operation where he was put in a coma. He couldn't speak. He couldn't walk after everything had been done to him. So essentially, he did not follow his advice. He took the easy way and just had it medically done to him after he first put himself in that position by abusing these drugs. Now, Peterson would obviously say in the past, that's your fault. No one forced you to start abusing these drugs. No one forced you to go and get this treatment in Russia, which is really ethically dubious if they don't do it in the West. And then, of course, his daughter also blamed Western medicine for putting him on these drugs in the first place. But even from his own story, we can see it's not his fault. He clearly has depression. His wife got a terminal cancer diagnosis. That would affect anyone. So it's pretty clear the answer to why he's addicted is because he's going through depression, he's going through anxiety. It's a really, really tough time. His wife is going to pass away from an awful disease. So he abuses something that makes him feel good. It's really a story as old as time. But this is just one example. But this one example already proves how full of rubbish his advice is. And as someone who doesn't really believe in free will, and you're just a product of your environment and you're conditioned by your environment and you don't really have a choice in most instances, I don't feel someone like Peterson had a choice. You know, he was very likely to become an addict after he started dealing with all these mental problems from something really traumatic happening to him. Now, before I left my job last Friday, I was a pharmaceutical industry journalist. I hope to continue doing that because I actually really enjoy the industry and there's very interesting topics. But I don't need to explain to you how capitalism and the pharmaceutical industry push addiction to make profit. You guys would have heard of Purdue Pharma and OxyContin. They knew this was a highly addictive painkiller. They knew it was more addictive than others on the market. They pushed it. They pushed doctors to overprescribe it. They paid speakers to downplay how bad it was. You can actually see leaked emails from 1995 where the Sackler family are discussing how addictive this thing is. And then in America, you have the worst opioid crisis in modern times where thousands upon thousands have died from addiction. And even in that little micro example, these people are just getting painkillers. That can be from anything, just a random injury. You know, I've broke my nose, I've cut my head open. I was given sort of weak painkillers. I didn't even take them because I didn't need them. But in America, I might have been prescribed OxyContin, which is very, very addictive. And if I start taking that, it makes me feel good. Maybe it makes me feel good in all aspects of my life. It makes me feel a bit better. Then you get addicted. But that's just another part of the problem. That's not a personal responsibility issue. That's a corrupt capitalist system where pharmaceutical companies will just exploit people to sell their drugs no matter what the cost to human life. And Purdue Pharma obviously doesn't exist in the way that it did anymore. It's paid billions and billions to fund opioid treatment, but none of the Sackler family have been criminally charged. And this goes through all pharmaceutical companies. That's something I realised while covering the industry. These companies have so much money, they will pay billions and billions in fines, and it's just a drop in the bucket for them, and no one will ever be criminally charged. Again, how can personal accountability, responsibility be the determining factor when you live in a system where these companies are insanely strong and they will exploit people? But now let's go into the socio-economic factors, which a lot of America's health bodies outline. Now I'm just going to read a good article by the National Institute on Drug Abuse titled "Addressing the Opioid Crisis Means Confronting Socio-Economic Disparity." So it goes on to say, opioid addiction is often described as an equal opportunity problem that can afflict people from all races, walks of life. But while true enough, this obscures the fact that the opioid crisis has particularly affected some of the poorest regions of the countries, such as Appalachia, and that people living in poverty are especially at risk for addiction and its consequences like overdosing or the spread of HIV. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention considers people on Medicaid and other people with low income to be at high risk for prescription drug overdose. Some of the reasons have to do with access and quality of economically disadvantaged regions. According to the US Department of Health and Human Services, people on Medicaid are more likely to be prescribed opioids at higher doses and for longer durations, increasing their risk for addiction and its associated consequences. They are also less likely to have access to evidence-based addiction treatment, but psychological factors also play a role. Last year, economists Anne Case and Angus Deaton attributed much of the increased mortality among the middle-aged white Americans to direct and indirect health effects of substance abuse, especially among those with less education who have faced increasing economic challenges and increased psychological stress as a result. But we cannot hope to abate the evolving crisis without also addressing the lost hope and opportunities that have intensified the demand for drugs among those who face the loss of jobs and homes due to the economic downturns. Reversing the opioid crisis and preventing future drug crises of this scope will require addressing the economic disparities, housing instability, poor education quality, and the lack of access to quality healthcare that currently plague many of Americans' disadvantaged individuals, families, and communities. So I said I didn't believe in free will, and it's kind of hard to do that. Of course, addiction to anything is going to increase when you have these external factors that affect everything. In my last video where I talked about leaving my job, I talked about my neurological problems and how they're made worse by stress. But if there was some sort of drug that would help my visual snow feel better, I would be at risk of abusing that drug because I'm under so much stress and I just want things to go back to normal. So there are so many external factors that affect why someone will become an addict. You can have more personal issues like Jordan Peterson's wife being diagnosed with cancer. You can have bigger issues about pressures on your job, where you live, your access to healthcare, your access to good information about drugs. Then you have other ones like pharmaceutical companies in this capitalist system paying doctors to overprescribe something that is very addictive and can lead to your death or can lead to you going and abusing worse illegal drugs that may have substances in them that can easily kill you. So I don't really know what Jordan Peterson's new book's going to be about. What, ignore all your own rules, become addicted to Xanax, and then go into a coma in some dodgy clinic in Russia and nearly basically die from not following your own advice, which you give so often to so many people in such an arrogant manner. You dismiss a lot of the groups on the left who push for progressive solutions to these issues, and I have a strong suspicion he's not going to change his mind despite dealing with such an awful traumatic period of time in his life. So let's please dispel the conservative, libertarian, centrist notion that most addiction comes from someone being weak, someone being lazy, or someone having some sort of personal defect which is their own fault, and recognize most addiction is caused by massive external factors and often it is brought on by the capitalist system. But anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you like this content, please like the video, maybe subscribe to the channel, and maybe check out my Patreon. Like I said, I'm going to actually start putting some benefits in there. Going to try and grow a community. We're going to have the Discord. Hopefully we're going to start some sort of like game night where I can play with patrons because I have a bit more free time now that I've left my job. If you want to check out anything else, podcast, Discord links, Medium links, anything like that, in the description as well. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.